Hello and welcome. You're watching Nothing But the Truth. The decision by 5 state governments to place a temporary ban on the eating of meat and the decision by the Jammu and Kashmir High Court to place a ban on the sale of beef has caused widespread consternation and provoked criticism. The question we ask today is this a correct decision or was it the wrong one? That's the key issue I shall explore today with the well-known politician, diplomat and author, Shashi Tharoor. Shashi Tharoor, let's start, however, a little differently. Let's begin by talking about you. You're a vegetarian. Would you be upset or offended if people around you ate meat or fish?
Not at all, and that's what troubles me. I mean, this is about personal choice. In fact, I've always felt that the entire meat ban issue in India is not about meat. It's about freedom. It's about the kind of India we want to live in. As a vegetarian, look, I was married to women who were meat eaters. I tried to bring up my children to eat whatever they wanted to. In fact, I had twin boys, one of whom was vegetarian, one was not. The fact is, what you put into your mouth is a fundamentally intimate decision that every individual should be free to make for themselves.
Let me ask you 2-3 critical questions about yourself. Do you have any problem if people around you eat beef?
No.
As a vegetarian, would you serve meat to non-vegetarians when they're your guests at home? Or would
I do indeed. I think, Karan, you've had meat at my home, so there you are. No, we do in fact serve meat, and the fact is that it's a question of respecting the dietary taste of the visitor. You want to make a guest feel comfortable and you want to extend hospitality. You would give them what they would enjoy eating. I don't want to impose my taste on them.
And finally, would you have any problem with meat being cooked or fish being cooked at your home?
It is cooked at my home. The only thing that I absolutely insist is that the two not be mixed up, so that in fact when I have a vegetarian dish that it hasn't acquired by osmosis, as it were, the flavors of meat elsewhere, or the same spoons and utensils are not used to serve it, and so on. I wouldn't pick, for example, I've been at friends' homes, Muslim friends in particular, where they cheerfully give me biryani and say you can take the rice without the pieces of meat, and I say thank you, let me skip that. But that's a question of personal taste. I don't feel offended by that. I just say that, you know, for myself, it's a purely personal, I might even say aesthetic feeling, that I'm revolted by the idea of eating it. But if you're not, please go ahead and eat it.
Let's then come to the decision by 5 BJP governments to place a temporary ban on the eating of meat. Now, was this acceptable and legitimate because it is done to respect the religious sentiments of a community during their holy days? And secondly, it was only done for a brief temporary period. Or is it unacceptable because it abridges the rights of individuals, which in a democracy should be sacrosanct?
The latter. In other words, when you are a Jain and you're practicing an important ritual, it's entirely natural that you want to do so in an environment that respects your faith. So you should perhaps do this amongst fellow Jains, you should do this in a particular area or a community, but you cannot then take that wish and demand of others that they respect it. It's entirely possible that many Jains have neighbors who, out of respect for them, will not cook meat during those days. But you cannot tell them by law, by a ban, that they cannot cook or eat or purchase meat. I mean, to my mind, that is an intrusion on their freedom. It's like the classic line that my freedom to wave my hand stops just short of your nose. I cannot. After all, I have the freedom to do this, but if you're standing here, I shouldn't, because it'll hurt you.
Now, in fact, the ban on the temporary eating of meat in Maharashtra goes back to the 1960s, and it was first imposed by Congress government. Similar bans have been imposed by Congress governments in Rajasthan. If the bans are wrong today, would you, and I know you're a Congress MP, accept they were wrong when they were originally imposed by Congress governments?
They were wrong all along, Karan, but what's interesting is they were not ruthlessly enforced. I've heard from many people, I myself was a child in Bombay at the time, that many were almost unaware there was a ban because, in fact, this kind of activity did not grind to a halt.
But the ban itself, you say, was wrong regardless of how it was enforced.
It's wrong because it is an intrusion on personal freedom.
Let me then quote to you the 2008 Supreme Court judgment written by Justice Markandeya Karju, who says that provided the ban is not for a considerable period, by which he means provided it's only a temporary short duration affair, it's both legitimate and constitutional. And this is what he writes. Non-vegetarians can surely remain vegetarians for 9 days in a year out of respect for the Jain festival. How do you respond to Justice Karju?
I think respect has to come voluntarily, Karan. You can't force me to respect you. And just like that, you cannot oblige me, and in fact you will actually generate resentment if you oblige me to do something that I don't want to do for your convenience, not mine. I can't rule on the constitutionality of all this. I'm neither a lawyer nor a judge, and I'm sure that court judgment is what determines constitutionality. I'm talking as a member of parliament, as a politician, as somebody who has an opinion on public policy. This is not right public policy because it narrows the space that our citizenry has to lead their lives according to their own lights without intruding on the freedoms of others.
I too will sidestep the question of constitutionality. Like you, I'm not a lawyer. Let's leave it to the lawyers and the courts to decide. But what I want to bring up is the ethics and morality of the matter.
That's the issue.
Would you agree with the following? That how long a ban is imposed for doesn't in any way ameliorate the fact that a ban is wrong. In other words, a short duration ban doesn't become acceptable, but a long duration one is.
I don't agree that timing has anything to do with it. 1 day, half an hour is equally wrong, number one. Number two, as far as the bans of this nature are concerned, why be selective? Why not ban pork all over the country on Eid? I mean, where are we going to start? Where are we going to stop? I mean, the fact is, as long as you're not going to a temple with a pork sandwich, I mean, I beg your pardon, a mosque with a pork sandwich, I don't think that you're offending anybody. The Muslims have the right to refuse to eat pork. They don't have the right to tell you not to eat pork. I mean, I'm vegetarian, so it doesn't bother me, but it does bother you.
Which means, in fact, that the essential core of Justice Kharju's argument that you can afford to do this, you can afford to put a ban for just 9 days, 9 days is not too much, is actually fallacious. It's confused thinking, because if a ban is wrong for a year, it's wrong for 9 days, it's wrong for 9 hours, it's wrong for 9 minutes.
Exactly. I couldn't have put it better.
Let me raise something else with you. In Rishikesh and Haridwar, the eating and selling of meat, eggs and fish are banned right through the year. And in 2004, the Supreme Court upheld this on the grounds that people go to Rishikesh and Haridwar for purification and prayer. Do you believe the Supreme Court was right to treat Rishikesh and Haridwar as separate to the rest of India, as sort of sui generis?
Yes, because space is a different issue from time. In other words, it is entirely possible to say this town exists in a sanctified way for a specific religious purpose, and with it comes various trappings. It's like saying that a particular town will mark a zone that is pedestrians only and no cars can go there. One cannot then make the argument that it is illegal and unconstitutional to do this because I have the freedom to drive my car. The town is right to say in this area only pedestrians will walk. Similarly, in these specific religious towns, it is entirely right to say this is not possible in this town. If you don't want to come to this town, that's fine. If you insist on eating meat and eggs every day, don't go to Haridwar. I don't see a problem with that. But what I do see a problem with is if you would impose it, you're living in Bombay eating meat and fish every day, and suddenly you're told, no, you can't do this for these 9 days because we tell you it offends us. There's a difference. So you can choose not to go and live in Haridwar, but you can't choose, you can't be forced to move home because you're not allowed to eat on a particular day. Connected
with your concept that it's okay in particular defined spaces is the corollary that in fact it has to have been happening there virtually from time immemorial.
Precise. I mean, look at Mecca. It's not time immemorial, it's only a few hundred years. But non-Muslims cannot set foot in Mecca. Now we understand the rules. I've been to Saudi Arabia, I've never tried to go to Mecca. Same principle. If a meat eater insists on eating meat every day, don't go to Haridwar. But specific places are allowed, it seems to me, to have specific rules, and that's what this is. It's very different from imposing something on people irrespective of faith. If you are somebody who must eat meat every day, you probably would not go and live in Haridwar. So your freedom is not affected to live elsewhere and eat meat every day.
So to sum up this particular bit of the interview, you agree with the Supreme Court upholding the ban on meat, fish and eggs in Rishikesh and Haridwar,
sure,
because that's a defined space and it's something that's been happening by convention virtually from time immemorial. But
every religion has the right to the sacred. What it doesn't have is to impose it on others.
That's where you disagree with Justice Kharju and the Supreme Court judgment of 2008, where on moral grounds you say you can't simply say that because a ban is for a short duration it becomes acceptable, because it's for a long duration it's not. Time and duration have nothing to do with the morality and rightness of a ban. A ban is wrong regardless of how long it's imposed for.
Exactly.
So with Kharju you do disagree.
On this one I disagree completely.
The second issue is the decision of the Jammu and Kashmir High Court to make illegal, on the basis of certain clauses of the Ranbir Penal Code, the killing of cows and the sale of beef. Now, the Ranbir Penal Code came into being in 1932. For 70 years or more, these sections banning the killing of cows and the sale of beef have not been observed at all. Suddenly, the High Court a couple of days ago, on the basis of a PIL, enforced them and insisted that this must happen. My key question is this: Was the High Court right to enforce these sections of the Ranbir Penal Code because courts exist to enforce the law, and this is clearly the law of the day? Or given that once a law becomes unusable or falls into disuse, it should be allowed to lapse? Which of the two would you go with?
Well, I think that depends on the inclination of the judges. I think the judges should have gone the other way and allowed it to lapse. But I said on the day of the judgment that if the government values opinion in the valley, it should immediately appeal this judgment. I regret very much that no action has been taken to appeal it, because I'm already getting reports of deeply inflamed sentiment in the valley, and in turn a backlash in the non-Muslim majority areas of the state. It's an unnecessary political problem that has been created by a judicial action that, in my view, was ill thought through, even though I agree with you that it cannot be challenged on legal grounds because the law does exist and the courts were upholding it. We've seen a similar thing on 377. The law exists. The courts have said, we're not going to touch it, even though a High Court had earlier said this is wrong and this law should essentially be got rid of. The Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to touch it. It remains on the books. I think the courts are sometimes very activist and sometimes mysteriously seem to confine themselves to the letter of the law without taking the broader interests of society.
Let me put this to you. The Ranbir Penal Code, which was legislated in 1932, is in fact an imposition by a Hindu Maharaja on a Muslim majority population at a time when India wasn't a democracy. Would you say that after India became a democracy, sections or maybe the entire penal code should have been reconsidered with a view to examining whether it fits in with the character, the lifestyle, the practices and the conventions of the people upon which it's imposed? Because if you do that, certainly these sections banning the killing of cows and the sale of beef would not accord with the character of the Kashmiri majority.
Well, the problem there, as you know, is that Kashmir has a different legal system. So they're not actually subject. Indians cannot sit in Delhi and tell them how to rewrite their code. This is something that Kashmir could have taken on for itself, and I don't think anyone would have stopped them. They, I think, prefer to let the law sit on the books and ignore it. To the best of my knowledge, it has not been properly or overtly either talked about or enforced or discussed until suddenly this court judgment brought it front and center.
So would you go one step further and say that the people who really are to blame are Kashmiri politicians who for 67 years since independence have not looked back on the Ranbir Penal Code and asked themselves the question, should these sections continue to be there? Because if they shouldn't, they should have been removed. That was a mistake done by politicians who were negligent.
This is arguably true. I mean, on a different, unrelated Kashmiri matter, my late wife was one of those who fought the rule that a Kashmiri subject who is a woman, if she marries a non-Kashmiri, loses the right she has as a subject, including
and this again goes back to the days of the Maharaja.
Again, this goes back to the Maharaja, and the modern day democratic Kashmiri politicians were lax in not addressing it. I'm told it was finally addressed under the National Conference government of Omar Abdullah in the Kashmir Assembly, but that was 60 years after independence.
I'm not sure if it was actually fully addressed. I think it was raised as an issue, but I don't think that bar has been removed. That bar still continues because the state considers it essential. But let me come back to the High Court, because Omar Abdullah, in an interview to me earlier this week, pointed out that there are sections of the Ranbir Penal Code which require or at least permit the state to tax prostitution. There are other sections which effectively make any criticism of the government sedition. Now, if the High Court is going to enforce the Ranbir Penal Code fully, then presumably it would have to enforce these sections as well. And if it does, the state would end up in a mess. So do you think the High Court and the judges concerned should have been a bit more thoughtful about what they were doing, because the repercussions and the consequences and the implications go much beyond just the limited action they've taken?
Yes, as I said, Karan, the inconsistency here is that this is a very literalist reading of the law, whereas on many, many occasions our judiciary has tended to go well beyond the letter of the law or even the Constitution to give it interpretations which were not explicitly spelled out in the law or the Constitution, but are in tune with the evolving nature of society. Judiciaries in all democracies tend to play this role, and we respect that.
Except this judiciary
but
clearly
in this particular case, and in the 377 judgment, judges have taken refuge or behind the letter of the law and not the spirit of society. And I think these are things we need to absolutely question. The truth is that governments can always take initiatives, you know, in both states and in the center. Governments can initiate legislative reform themselves. They don't need to wait for judges to do so. But where this hasn't happened, It is only the judges who can, and in this particular case, we've been ill-served, I believe.
And so would you say, in fact, I'm using your very words, the judges have ill-served the people of Jammu and Kashmir? They should have been more thoughtful, they should have been more aware of what is acceptable, what is not, what the spirit of the times would require, and that they haven't done. They've been literal rather than thoughtful.
Absolutely, and in fact, they have stoked a degree of angst, a degree of dissatisfaction, a degree of resentment, which is already beginning to manifest itself, and which frankly we don't need. We have far bigger things at stake in Kashmir than what people eat or don't eat. There are fundamental issues in Kashmir. The national interest exceeds the interest of the religious sentiments of any community, including mine.
Let's come to the response of the government of the day in Kashmir. Mehbooba Mufti has made it clear that her government, according to certain newspaper reports, will not enforce the ban either on the slaughter of cows or on the sale of beef. Now, in your eyes, is that defiance of the law and contempt of court, or is it in fact a bold attempt to stand up for the rights of the Muslim majority in Kashmir? Which of the two?
It's actually both, Karan. That's the irony. It's politically the right thing to do to actually prevent an eruption. You know, there are already people out on the streets protesting this. You don't want this to be a tinderbox that can be ignited. So politically, they have said something to try and calm down the passions. But of course, legally, constitutionally, for an elected government to openly defy the judiciary like this, contempt, of course, is very strong language and only judges can determine that, but it certainly calls into question respect for the law.
And that is missing here.
Of course, and I would have urged the government, appeal the judgment and say, look, we're in the process of scrapping this law. In the meantime, we believe you should review this judgment.
The government hasn't appealed, which is surprising. But do you think this government, given that Kashmir is a Muslim majority, should have passed an ordinance, which it can do, to say, as of today, these sections of the Repeal Penal Code will not be enforced anymore? Because that they could have done if they wanted to.
I suppose they still can. The problem is that they didn't. I mean, look, let's face it.
So politicians have let down the Kashmiri people as well as thoughtless judges?
Up to a point. You know, as somebody who's been in government, let me say that I'm very conscious that sometimes problems don't actually occur to you until they erupt, simply because you're busy doing everything else.
But when they do erupt, surely you need to act.
Exactly. And that's why, you know, you look at my Twitter for whatever it was, more than a week ago, I said the government should appeal immediately. This judgment will actually vitiate the situation in Kashmir, and we have bigger fish to fry.
And so the Kashmir government is guilty of inaction.
I would say
criminal inaction almost.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I would certainly say that they should have acted more rapidly and expeditiously. And the method you've chosen of saying, here's the law, here's the judgment, we will ignore it. It may calm passions, but it's very bad governance.
Let's broaden our discussion. You've been an MP for just over 6 years. You've got to understand the Indian system. You've got to understand at first hand the nature of people who become politicians in India. Many say that Indian politicians readily acquiesce to bans because actually they neither understand and, more importantly, they don't respect the right of individuals to choose. Politicians feel somehow they have the capacity, they have the wisdom to decide for the people as a whole. Would you accept that interpretation of them?
Well, some do. I mean, the truth is that, you know, if you look at the principles that have been enshrined in our Constitution, if you read, as I've had the pleasure of doing, the Constituent Assembly debates, we had some very far-seeing statesmen and stateswomen in the Constituent Assembly who were deeply anchored in these principles.
But wasn't that a different generation?
It was a different generation, but these are the principles that bequeathed to us, which, whatever our beliefs may be, we have an obligation to uphold. And therefore, for politicians, we don't enough. We don't enough. Both in the states and in the centre, we have seen a narrowing of the Indian mind, increasing number of people who are anxious to be offended by the slightest provocation, real or imagined, and an anxiety on the part of those in power to appease them, often in the name of law and order, saying, if we don't do this ban, there will be a riot tomorrow, some people will be killed, they'll be on our conscience, it's better to ban and therefore calm down the passions of those who are offended. Well, we're going to be a country of run by the offended, rather than by those who are thoughtful.
In fact, one of the reasons why we're ending up in that particular predicament is because when it comes to choosing between the rights of individuals and between what politicians believe is the amorphous right of society as a whole, it's the right of society that gets prominence and predominance. The right of the individual is made subservient to that. Do you think we get the priority wrong? Because individuals at the end of the day is what we are. Individuals is what the Constitution upholds. Society is a sort of amalgam that politicians have created when they want to justify what they're doing in the name of the greater good.
This is going to be a much longer and more complicated conversation, because actually ours is both. We do in fact recognize communities. The very existence of something like Muslim personal law is that you've allowed a particular community defined religiously to have its own legal system when it comes to marriage, inheritance and divorce, and so on. So we are a constitution that not only recognizes individual citizenship, which is what most Western democracies do, but also finds space for collective communal feelings and wishes. The problem is, of course, that it's politicians interpreting what the community wants. It's other politicians deciding which of these interpretations to surrender to. And we have often seen, going right back, and I'll certainly accept the Shah Banu case as an example, we've often seen the most retrograde views of a community being interpreted as the view that must be paid political heed to. And as a result, some of the core principles of our democracy have not always been constructively and progressively interpreted.
And as a result, the right of an individual often becomes subservient to the bigger community that he is a part of, and therefore the individual becomes, in a sense, made an opposed element to the community. Individuals don't get the regard, they don't get the attention that they would say in the West.
Well, there are two views. There is the I am and therefore we are, and there is the we are and therefore I am. The collective, for example, many African societies argue that the entire individual identity is and must be subsumed to the collective. In India, the constitution would actually be more in favor of the individual superseding the collective within the rules, within the constitution, within the laws. But as I say, because both coexist in our legal system and in our political practice, there is often a very important need to strike a balance between the two, between the individual and the collective, and sometimes from an individualist point of view, we get the balance wrong.
Is this where Indian democracy differs from the major Western democracies, that they concentrate on the individual, on individual rights and the assertion of the individual? We've balanced, or sometimes I'd say blur. Maybe blur is better in India, between the individual and between the community.
I think we do. I mean, the Westerners certainly are quite different. Even on an issue like freedom of expression, for example, ours is a democracy which enshrines freedom of expression, but the actual letter of the law is not all that free and open, because it conditions it on various things that you can't do. Your freedom of expression stops short of anything that offends the territorial integrity of India, that affects friendly relations with foreign countries, which would make free discussion of international affairs
almost impossible.
All of that. However, practice has been liberal and judicial interpretations have been liberal, and that's what's kept us going as a free democracy. Reading something like Justice Kaul's judgment in the Delhi High Court on the M.F. Hussain cases, for example. Very, very liberal, expansive interpretation. There have been cases in the Supreme Court on film censorship, very liberal. And it seems to me that we have been fortunate that a succession of progressive-minded judiciary judgments by the courts and a succession of enlightened Democrats in political office have expanded the space beyond the letter of the Constitution and the laws. What worries me is that a more narrow-minded government could easily return to that letter, and the culture of banning has to be resisted today for fear of how much worse it can become tomorrow.
The corollary of what you're saying, and I'll put it to you very briefly because we're running out of time, is that our system, what you call balancing, what I call sometimes blurring, depends on the fortune of good judges and good politicians to blaze a trail through it which upholds the rights of individuals without offending the community. But if you fall into the hands of unwise judges and narrow-minded politicians, you could end up with the worst of both.
Exactly. And we've seen this in the emergency. We've seen it in certain decisions in certain state governments. There is no question that the Constitution and the letter of the law can be used in a way that is fundamentally violative of democratic freedoms. We have to be vigilant, and that includes you in the media. Instead of wasting time on voyeurism, the media should focus on these kinds of issues and enlighten people about the need to be vigilant in protection of the freedoms that we are so casually allowing to be vitiated by things like meat bans. As I said, this is not about meat, it's about our freedom.
Not just the media, we need sagacious politicians also who can decide when are meat bans necessary, when are they not, how long are they necessary for, and what is the justification that should be given when they are given. We need intelligent journalists, but we also need intelligent and thoughtful politicians.
Agreed.